Great to be here. Everyone ready to digest your food with a little discussion of geopolitics? Yes? So I don't know about you, I'm sure there are some risk managers in the room. I'm a risk manager, but I'm also a political scientist, and I gotta tell you, I think it's a great time to be alive. Honestly. I mean, the nexus of these two things at this particular juncture in our history, this is just wonderful. Who wants to be a risk manager with nothing to think about, or a political scientist with nothing to analyze? There's no problem now. So, with that said, what I would like to do today is I would like to talk about our current geopolitical situation and the nexus that we have also with cyber and AI. I know that's been a theme that's been talked about with many of the other speakers, but I'm going to perhaps put a little bit different twist on it. You know, I think this is a great way to think about the world. What you see on the outside are trends, and on the inside are risks. And the color-coded things on the inside, the diamonds, are all about 5 different subjects. So it used to be the case that maybe politics intersected with economics, but now, today, you've got it with a bunch of other things, with technology, with the environment, with socio-cultural issues, for example. So I think this is a very useful framework because it shows that we've got trends on the outside, such as rising income disparity and rising urbanization and geographic mobility. And then on the inside, we've got things like extreme weather events and profound social instability. And what this shows is that everything is connected with everything else. So if you think about it in those terms, you're thinking, wow, it's not just about politics anymore. It's about all these other different things. Now, I don't know how many of you have thought about what you do on your daily basis in your jobs in those terms, but really what this means is that everyone ultimately has to be at least a little bit a political scientist and a social scientist and a climatologist in order to get things right. We're not accustomed to thinking of ourselves that way, are we? But in a way, I think you'll find that all of us are. If you spend any time reading the headlines and thinking about what it means, then you know as much, perhaps even more, than some of those talking heads you see on TV. Now, what this shows is country risk ratings for 20 different countries from 2 different information providers. On the left is a country risk information provider, and on the right is a rating agency. So isn't this interesting? They're both rating the same set of 20 countries, but they're both using perceived risk in a very different way. Now, if you're a consumer of this information, how are you supposed to make any sense of all of this? Ultimately, it's up to you to put this into your own context and make sense of it in terms of what it means for your company and in your own experience. And this is an important point, and that is that all of us travel around the world. We need to think about what we're doing in terms of trading, investing, and lending across the world in terms of our own experience, because you can read it in a newspaper, you can see it on TV, but unless you've experienced for yourself, you're really not going to know which end is up. And many of these quote-unquote experts differ wildly on the nature of risk in a given country. And of course, on a transactional level, it's going to be very different as well, based on your experience and country-specific laws and which country you come from and whether those 2 countries are getting along well with one another. That certainly has become an issue for Americans in the current political era. But another challenge here is this nexus between populism and nationalism. Just look at this list of leaders that has been produced in recent years as a result of this nexus. Mr. Trump is one of them, of course. But we have Modi, a sensation in India, Duterte in the Philippines, Jokowi in Indonesia, Erdogan in Turkey, and Orban in Hungary. They all have something in common, don't they? We're living in a world now where economic nationalism and what's in it for me matters. It's not just as a result of the Trump era that we're seeing this. This is a global phenomenon. It has an impact on everything that each of us does in the business arena internationally. The question is, do we realize it, do we focus on it, and do we pay attention to it? What we're seeing in the current geopolitical sphere is that there is no distinct center of gravity. I think many of you have heard the term a G0 world before. That's really what we're living in. And it's not just the US and it's not just China, the two biggest players in this arena. It's a lot of other countries, a lot of other leaders from a lot of other places that didn't used to make a difference, that now do make a difference by virtue of the fact there's so many of them who were elected in the same way, who have the same mind frame. And the collective impact on all of us is pretty significant. It's a transaction-based landscape. And that's not just because that's what Mr. Trump has turned this into from an American perspective, a dollars and cents issue, if you will. This is basically economic nationalism in a brazen way, and the impact that it has on every one of us by virtue of the fact that everybody's doing business with everybody else and interacting with everybody else. Compounding it, of course, is that there are fewer checks and balances. There really are. Do you think this is perhaps more a law-driven world or perhaps a less law-driven world? And I ask that question because what matters at the end of the day? What matters is relationships and bilateral relationships and business relationships as never before. So does all of this imply that there's a guarantee of Chinese supremacy going forward? Well, we're going to explore that a little bit. Suffice it to say for now that I'm a believer that this is the Chinese century. And if you think about it from a Chinese perspective, they're just picking up where they left off with 150 years ago when they were the leading economic power. As Americans, we're not necessarily accustomed to thinking of it in those terms, but it really is true. So from the Chinese perspective, they're picking up where they left off. Now, all of that taken into account, you would think that we would be in a much more violent and conflict-ridden world. But in fact, that isn't the case. As this shows, interstate conflict from 1970 through going forward into the 2030s, it's a dramatic decline in interstate conflict, starting in the end of the 1970s and onward. There's a little blip from 1915 through right now just because of things like Yemen and the South Sudanese War and other conflicts like that. But the era of big power conflict has largely disappeared. Not only because the stakes are so high, but because of the type of interaction that economies have with one another. They want to keep things friendly. But the same is true also in terms of intrastate conflict. It peaked in the early 90s, and it's been going down ever since with a little blip in the middle of this decade, and it's projected to keep going that way. I mean, have you ever actually really stopped and thought, is this a more violent, conflict-ridden world? The statistics actually say it's less so. There are, of course, some pockets where that's still an issue, and there always will be. But this is an extraordinary era of peacefulness that perhaps many of us don't appreciate. Now, let me take you through a few hot spots and give you some thoughts on all of these. Mr. Maduro in Venezuela. What happened to 20 or 30 years ago and much further behind that in American history when America would snap its fingers and Latin America would step right into place? Well, that's definitely gone. One reason why that is in the case of Venezuela is that China and Russia are very active behind the scenes. Many of you may not realize that Venezuela has borrowed $60 billion from China and $25 billion from Russia. So who are they going to be listening to? The people and the government. So the people, in theory, benefited. But here's a tremendously rich, resource-rich country which should, not have any need to borrow any money from anybody. But we know the reason why. It's terribly corrupt, et cetera. What's interesting about Venezuela, I think, is that there's a big power play going on behind the scenes with Russia and China. Now, the Russians, I don't know how many of you saw this past week, have basically just announced that they're withdrawing some of their companies from Venezuela because I think they just think it's too much of a mess. But China has derived so much of its source of oil from Venezuela that it's not leaving anytime soon. But the days of gunship diplomacy and simply snapping our fingers and they snap to attention are pretty much gone. I mean, if you compare some US history in Latin America, say in Chile or Guatemala, for example, with what's going on today, it's really a stark contrast. Brazil. So interesting about Brazil. How many of you have been to Rio? A few of you? Yeah, it's a really impressive city, isn't it? So when Brazil became a BRIC about 15 years ago, everybody thought how wonderful this is. How many people thought about, does Brazil really deserve to be a BRIC? It had $200 billion worth of debt. It had just come out of a military government. Its GDP had been anemic for decades. And yet, here it is almost flatlining compared with the other BRICS nations, and it was brought into the fold because of the potential of 200 million people and tremendous natural resources. But it turns out it was not such a good news story. I saw just this past week, Brazil is projected to have continued anemic growth, GDP growth of less than 1%. So, is Bolsonaro likely to get things right? No way. He's not going to be able to get things right. Is he going to eradicate corruption? Is he suddenly going to make the country less dependent on exports to China, et cetera? No. But if you look both at Venezuela and Brazil and you think about how rich they are in terms of natural resources and where they are today, it's kind of astonishing. Just goes to show, having a big pool of oil under you doesn't necessarily mean anything good is going to happen. How about Mr. Putin? You know, he's a very controversial figure here, but there's a lot of people around the world who really like him. And it's not just because he spends so much time with his shirt off. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of world leaders that we clearly do not want to see without their shirts. But, you know, it's actually not bad. It's pretty good. What I would say there is that he's doing some really impressive things in terms of mopping up where the US is leaving its own influence behind. And it doesn't get a lot of airtime here necessarily, but what Russia is doing in the Middle East, for example, is very, very impressive. So Putin is not going anywhere. I personally view the fact that Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin apparently have such a good relationship as a good thing. I mean, what's the alternative after all? And then in terms of alleged Russian intrusiveness in the 16 and 18 and future to come 20 election, I mean, what's the worst issue here? Is it worse that they're doing it, or is it worse how easy it is for them to do it? And how easy it was in 18 after we knew about it in 16, and presumably how easy it will be in the next election. I mean, we need to wake up on a national level. We need to turn our electoral systems from being 50 separate states into being one national arrangement. That's probably the only way that we're ever going to successfully battle this problem. MBS, Mohammed bin Sultan in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, he's in the headlines a lot, of course, because of Mr. Khashoggi and the assassination. But he's really trying to do some very impressive things in Saudi Arabia, and not just by having women drive. I mean, he wants to help reformulate the economy, and, I mean, you have to give him credit that he's bold enough to do it. So Mr. Trump got a lot of criticism when his first stop as president was actually to go to Saudi Arabia. But I understand why. I mean, he knew that we were going to continue our basic withdrawal from the Middle East, and there's no more important player in the Middle East than Saudi Arabia. So with China clearly having greater influence in places like Saudi Arabia as well, we want to keep our friends and keep them close. I don't know that there would necessarily be anything that any other president, Democrat or otherwise, would be doing vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. We want to keep them close. They're very, very important. Iran. Mr. Khamenei, he's still there, he's still in power. So interesting, of course, you've seen in the headlines that Iran has basically said that they're going to breach the highly enriched uranium amount allowed under the JCPOA, actually by the end of next week, and I don't doubt that they'll do that. Ultimately, to me, the JCPOA is already dead. The question is, what is Europe going to do next? Europe has a real decision to make as the other members in the JCPOA. They're basically going to have to decide, if they breach this, are we going to continue doing business with them? Are we going to continue to abide by the agreement? Very, very difficult decision to make. From my perspective, I wouldn't expect that it's going to survive as an agreement. And perhaps this was written in the stars from the beginning, from the first time that it was understood that we were going to be pulling out of the agreement. I think the Iranians are basically saying that we're going to step up as far to the line as we possibly can without breaching it. The question is, how far will that go, and will there be some accident in between that triggers a major world war? I don't even think Saudi Arabia wants a war. I mean, they're already involved in Yemen, right? So how thinly can they possibly spread themselves? We've said we don't want a war. The Iranian foreign minister said they don't want a war. So what is this all about? How far is it going to go? I think the real test ultimately is going to be if Iran gets close to producing a nuclear weapon, what are the Israelis or anybody else going to do? And I'm not sure. North Korea. So a lot of people who are North Korea experts said there's no way when the start of this bilateral approach to eradicating their nuclear weapons started that it was going to be successful. You know, you look at the family history of the Kims, et cetera. There were a few who said there might be a chance that this is going to happen. I said at the time, I wrote at the time, that if you want this to be successful, you're going to have to meet him halfway. And I was really disappointed that Mr. Trump did not, actually, because there really was, I think then, an opportunity to get something meaningful done. I'm not so sure that opportunity still exists. As for Mr. Trump, how many of you have considered the possibility that he is not actually the change agent, but is perhaps a change agent, and that what awaits us in this country and elsewhere in the world are perhaps far more profound change agents to come? Personally, I think disruption is a good thing if it's done with some thought and some care and done the right way. I'm an independent. I just want to go on record as saying that. This comment is not partisan at all. I would say, frankly, there's a lot of stuff that I personally like about what Mr. Trump is doing. I may not necessarily like the tactics. The question is, whoever succeeds him, will he or she be successful in reversing much, if anything, that he has done over that 4 or 8 year period? That remains a question in my mind, and I'm not so sure that a lot of these things actually are reversible. Perhaps, maybe, nor should they be. So this is from the cover of my latest book, which is called China Vision, which is all about China's attempt to create an alternative worldview based on its own image. You see Mr. Xi is looking through some military binoculars, and he's dressed in a Mao suit, and all he sees when he looks through those binoculars, of course, is the Chinese flag and things Chinese. Well, I don't know how many of you have noticed, but he's not in the habit of actually wearing a Mao suit. But he's become the most authoritarian leader in China since then. And I think he's very deliberate and very smart about what he's doing. The thing that concerns me the most, I suppose, is that a lot of what he and China is doing is being done without any objection, any visible objection to much of the rest of the world. And so China is almost a free agent to do much of whatever it wants. Now, if you're in Asia, you're accustomed to thinking about China in those terms, that it's an 800-pound gorilla, and all you really want to do is be friends with China and do what you can to manage the relationship. I think a lot of what's being done is fairly responsible, and there's some stuff that is not. But consider the Chinese worldview. China is picking up from where it was 150 years ago. 150 years ago, it was the world's largest economy. It was the world's most important and powerful nation. So from the Chinese perspective, what they're doing is picking up where they left off. I'm not sure many Americans necessarily realize that. From their perspective, it might be their own version of manifest destiny. Their credo is a little bit opposite of what we read in the Bible, which is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, not here. In this case, it's whatever you don't want them to do to you, don't do to them. And so there are basically few boundaries and few rules from the Chinese worldview perspective. Basically, they're going to elbow their way to the front of the line. They're going to get away with whatever they can get away with. And in large part, there are few people who are objecting to any of this. If they're doing it maybe behind closed doors. Or if they're doing it perhaps not too loudly. So in a way, it's incumbent upon China to act as a responsible agent, because actually, who's going to make them do otherwise? So what does Washington actually want from Beijing? I think they want three basic things. Played by the same set of rules. You know, we're all part of the WTO and lots of other legal mechanisms, so just abide by those rules. You know, almost every time the US has taken China to the WTO, it has actually won. So it's been a very useful mechanism, and we want more of that. How about level that playing field on trade? I actually, here again, am in favor of what Mr. Trump has done with China for a very simple reason. We've tried everything else, and they don't respond very well to pretty please with sugar on top. So a sort of a 2x4 upside the head is unfortunately what is required, and that's exactly what he's delivering. Unfortunately, Americans are paying a big price for that in terms of those tariffs. The third thing is that we want China to act as a responsible global leader. And in many respects, it's doing just that. You know, there's very little that gets done in many corridors of power without the wink and the nod of China. In many respects, what we used to be in terms of an omnipotent power and what we still are to a limited extent. But we can't make China act as a responsible power, so it's incumbent upon them ultimately to do that. What does Beijing want from us? They want us to mind our own business. And they basically are saying, we're not going to play in your pool, and you don't play in our pool, and everything will be fine. How about practicing what you preach? They can look at the various conflicts we've been involved and the application of the rule of law, and they can say, you know, you've breached a lot of laws yourself. How about stop trying to impede their rise? And that's really a big concern here, isn't it? I mean, no power that's sitting on top of the throne actually wants to believe that they're no longer going to be sitting on the throne for very long, and yet history shows us that in almost every case, that is the case. So, is China a poor cousin or a guiding light? They want us to believe that they are a poor cousin, that they've got all these poor people there, and they're actually a developing country. But what they've really done is they've acted as both a developing country when convenient and a developed country when convenient. So, for example, when it comes to borrowing from multilateral development banks, I mean, why on earth should the world's second largest economy, with by far the biggest collection of foreign exchange in the world, why should they be considered an eligible borrower from a multilateral development bank? Well, they'll take all the money they can get like anybody else would, which is fine. But I'll tell you another reason why, and that is if you think about the capacity of the lending institutions globally, who else is going to mop up all that excess liquidity? Is Bangladesh going to take all that money? I don't think so. So it's served a very useful purpose for the MDBs as well. Are they likely to conquer the world? Well, not militarily. That's not their style. But they're conquering the world in another way, and that is economically, and also through, you know, soft power. Some of the things that they're doing in other parts of the world are mind-boggling. They are investing so many hundreds of billions of dollars into Africa, for example, having such a huge impact developmentally, but also, of course, getting their needs met by investing in infrastructure projects, investing in natural resources that they can extract, et cetera. They're doing big, big things on the African continent. It doesn't get a lot of airtime here. So are they looking to replace the existing order or work within it? Part of the irony is that China became what it is by working within the existing order. And now, in a sense, it's trying to replace it with an alternative one that's shaped in China's own image. Can we necessarily blame China for wanting to do that? No, that's what nations do, and many could argue that we've done the same thing. I don't think they want to blow up the existing system. I think they want to partially create a new one and partially work within the one that we've got. Let me speak for a short while about cyber risk, because I think this nexus between cyber risk and geopolitics is interesting. And I don't know how many of you have thought about the threat landscape where cyber is concerned, but I like to look at it in terms of three domains: fragile, robust, and anti-fragile. So in the fragile domain, you have expected losses. You know, for instance, that if you don't have good cyber hygiene in your business, you're likely to have a problem. In the unexpected loss category, you've got the ransomware attacks, you've got the Snowdens of the world. By the way, the NSA knew that Snowden was a bad actor, and they looked the other way because he was really smart and really talented. I don't know how many of you have seen the film Snowden, but this is all outlined in there. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. These are the types of things that can sink a ship if you look the other way. Then there are the catastrophic losses like cyber warfare, the wars of the future that are going to be fought, and in some respects are already being fought. That's going to become more prevalent as time goes on. So why does the private sector so often fall short in the cyber arena? Most of us are unprepared, especially if you happen to be part of smaller or medium-sized businesses. You don't necessarily devote the resources. You don't have the resources to devote to this problem. You think it's somebody else's problem, and then when it lands on your doorstep, you become reactive, which is unfortunate. Very few people are experts. You can certainly get third parties who are expert and bring them into your shop, and that's what a lot of companies do. But unless you're a big organization, you're generally not going to be able to do that with much ease. And the biggest risk is insider threats. What I like to say is between the chair and the keyboard, 95% of what goes wrong in the cyber arena in companies comes from insider threats, whether it's deliberate or accidental. Then there's the question of reputation risk. Once you lose your reputation, do you ever get it back? A lot of smaller and medium-sized businesses, for example, that have a cyber attack are out of business within 6 months because they couldn't recover, because people have lost confidence in them. You may have heard that Mr. Trump last year basically made a proclamation and told the rest of the world that if you interfere with our infrastructure, we will consider it an act of war, and we reserve the right to respond with a nuclear response. Now, why is that? It's because we're highly, highly vulnerable. We're operating in many respects in our power plants, our water filtration systems, for example. We're operating on 1970s technology. And why is that? Because we haven't spent the money to fix it, because it's cost many trillions of dollars. And so every year that goes by, it gets worse and worse. Now, you may have seen over the weekend that we have basically said that we have bugs in all of Russia's major infrastructure as well. So it's mutual assured destruction. Same is true, you can be sure, with many other countries we're not talking about, with China, with Iran, etc. Iran has tried to infiltrate a number of our infrastructure over the years. This is going to become a more profound risk with time. And when something goes wrong, as it did with Ukraine a couple of times, courtesy of Russia, where they shut down the power system in the middle of winter for hours or days at a time, we will definitely stand up and take notice. If you think about cybersecurity in this term, you see the security controls on the left and then the human operating system on the right. That human operating system has stayed basically static. And if you look at how the Windows operating system has grown with time, it started at a very basic level, and then it's grown, to biometrics and credential guards and all sorts of things over the years. The biggest risk is and will remain ourselves. So I'm sure you've heard this song and dance before about making sure that you have good cyber hygiene. It's extremely important. The truth is that most companies either have next to none, or they remain solely focused on devoting their resources toward compliance issues, which is understandable. But in the meantime, what gets lost in translation is some of the longer-term solutions and creating metrics frameworks which set yourself up for ongoing success on a long-term basis. Many organizations devote the substantial amount of resources in the cyber arena to two things: information technology and physical and information security. The problem is that they devote so much of their resources to this that at the end of the day, there's nothing left for any of the other parts of the company. And that, of course, is a prescription for a future problem. So if you want good cyber hygiene in your company, it's going to basically boil down to three things: having the right people, processes, and technology in place. How many of you feel that your company has all three of those things in place? Only a few hands raised. So, important. Now on to AI. This is from the cover of my book, AI Supremacy, which came out last year. And if you see, what you have is a genuine race going on between countries and companies. So the heads of the robot are the countries, and the body are the companies, the majority companies in each of these countries. You see, it's hard to distinguish who's in the lead here. Is it China or is it in the US? If you ask a Chinese person, they're going to say it's Chinese. You ask an American person, they're going to say it's the US. The US, I think, is still in the lead, but not for very long. Some of you may be aware that China's spending up to $150 billion over the next decade to devote to becoming supreme in the AI arena. And they're doing that at a time when many other countries are spending next to nothing. I mean, we get excited when we spend a couple of $1 billion allocated to the Pentagon, while these folks are spending tens of billions on an ongoing basis. But data is the new oil. As I said in the earlier presentation on AI, this is what it's all about, folks, our ability to process, to acquire, to analyze data. This is job number one for any company that wants to be competitive in the AI arena. If you look at where we are in terms of computer performance versus human performance, the computer performance is not far behind where we are. We get excited about robots that can jump up and down. The truth is we're not as far along as perhaps many of us think we are in terms of AI. I think we're at the beginning of the beginning portion of the runway. There's a huge amount of things that lie ahead of us that need to be addressed. Governance, as we discussed, is certainly one of them this morning. If you look at human progress versus time, you can see the little figure there. Once we reach that nexus where computers no longer need to be taught to do things and they can think for themselves, it's going to zoom. And as I said this morning, I think that's the time when we are ultimately going to be realizing our true human potential. Ultimately, AI is going to be able to do things that we could never even dream of. So what's China's quest in the AI arena? They have this 2030 vision where they're spending this $150 billion. They're acquiring companies. They're ramping up their education. They're doing everything they can to reign supreme. What they're also doing is they're combining public and private sector initiatives, which is something that we are not doing and concerns me a great deal, because we have so many tremendous resources at our disposal. What we don't have is a strategy. And right now, it's sort of a free-for-all, and it's probably going to remain that way. The best companies are going to do their job, and that's what will happen. But in China, they've got tremendous capital, people, and computing power, and they combine that with something called unrestricted warfare, which means there are no rules. Anything that needs to be done to get to the front of the line, to get to the objective, is what they're going to do. And that's where this IP and state theft of intellectual property comes in. Why are they poised to lead? They've got the data. They got tremendous data, and they're going to get more. And they're innovating, and they have more unicorns in China by far than much of the rest of the developed world. In terms of AI's impact on international relations, well, it's old world meets new world. I mean, our legal structure internationally has not really kept pace with what's going on in the AI arena. We have weakened norms, we have weakened rule of law, and we basically have a free-for-all going on. How can we tell the difference in terms of fake news, what's real and what's fake? Does everybody remember, I think a week or two ago, when Nancy Pelosi supposedly said something on video and it turned out to be AI? Can you imagine the election we're going into in 2020, where we're going to have such realistic AI, we're not going to know what's real and what's fake and what a candidate said and what a candidate didn't. It's going to be up to them to prove that they didn't say it. And that's just the beginning. What impact does that have on reputation risks for individuals and companies, and even at a national level? Well, the sky's the limit. As for the law, in the legal arena, they're already practicing predictive analytics. Judges are already using AI to determine guilt or innocence. We have the GDPR governing the cyber arena in Europe. What do we have to govern the AI arena internationally? There are some initiatives that are underway on a multilateral basis in the UN and with the OECD, and that's all good, but again, far behind the curve. Is AI a human right? Is the ability to access it a human right? And is the ability not to take part in AI a human right? Does anybody even ask us necessarily? And do we even realize that when we're using Siri or Alexa, that's AI and it's sitting in many of our kitchens? That's something that's going to be a consideration going forward. So should we be pessimistic or optimistic about our future? Should we be panicked or should we be giddy? I would argue that it's somewhere in the middle. If AI is properly managed at the societal, at the national, at the corporate level, well, then there's hope, I suppose. But if it's not, it could easily spin out of control, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. So, key risks. Will there actually be a major geopolitical crisis? Isn't it interesting that with all the disruption that's gone on, and with all of the drum beating that's gone on between leaders and nations, that we haven't had any major conflicts in quite a few years now? You know, there's some lingering ones, of course, but will it actually happen? I'm willing to bet that there's not going to be a major conflagration before the election. Now, some would argue that that is exactly what a wag the dog strategy would assume is going to happen. But if, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the US have all said they don't want war, well, when I see it, I'll believe it. Let's see. Economic downturn, not if it will happen, but when it will happen. We all know we are well overdue for a major economic downturn. All the statistics tell us that this is off the charts. The markets seem to just brush off any bad news. Oh yeah, we thought about that, never mind, let's move on and make some money. I mean, this is uncharted territory. History does no longer mean what it used to mean. You used to be able to pick stocks based on prior performance. You used to be able to predict the behavior of a country based on prior performance. That's just not being done anymore. So there's nothing but question marks pervading. How about successive cyber attacks? That is a big risk. If there is a successful attack on our infrastructure, or there is our successive cyber attacks on major businesses, I think that could be something that could easily spin out of control. How about falling behind the AI curve? Can anybody in this room really afford, on an individual, business, national level, to fall behind the AI curve? And yet many businesses do not make this a priority. They're thinking, I'll react when the time comes, or it's not my problem, it'll happen to somebody else, just like we might think about cyber risk. I think ultimately the biggest risk that we have is complacency. The idea that it will happen to somebody else is not going to happen to us, and we don't need to do anything about any of these things I've been talking about. I clearly don't think that's true. So what I would leave you with is this image of somebody who knows there's something coming down the pike. He is prepared for it. He knows that he is going to need to react, and he's got the ability to react at a moment's notice and pivot at a moment's notice. And so I would suggest that's a position all of us should be taking. So with that, let me just leave you with a few minutes to answer some questions. Thank you very much. Sir.
On the geographic side, India, you didn't mention them, and I just read something that they're going to be the largest nation in 20 years based on birth rates, and the U.S. is trying to, I think, move with them. They have had problems with China. Give us your thoughts there.
Yeah, so, you know, India has, as you might imagine, tremendous potential, but I think in many respects they're their own greatest enemy. They sort of can't get out of their way when it comes to, you know, bureaucracy and regulation. And they have a real challenge on their hands because they've got 6 major religions and, you know, all sorts of ethnicity issues going on. I mean, Mr. Modi deserves credit, and I think he deserves to have been reelected for some of the initiatives that he's made, but they have a long, long way to go. If you drive from New Delhi to the Taj Mahal, which should be, you know, their most prized road, putting their best foot forward, et cetera, it takes you hours to get there. There's all sorts of stuff on the road. Nothing seems to work. I think if India can figure out a way to turn its diversity into its strength, it also has the potential to be a powerhouse. But as of now, I would say, you know, there's really no risk that China is going to be threatened by any Asian power anytime soon, India included. The question was, do I see partnership with the U.S. more so than China? You mean the U.S. partnering with China versus Yeah, no, clearly, I mean, India's on our side, and we want to keep it that way, and they want to keep it that way. I mean, ultimately, we don't want China to be our adversary. The question is, what is it going to take to solve this trade problem? So they formally announced that Trump and Xi are going to meet on the sidelines of the G20, which is great, and it's also been expected. I personally don't expect that that's going to result in a breakthrough. And I wrote an article recently, just last week, which was suggesting that maybe what is turned into a bit of a freeze in relations could turn into a permanent freeze based on how this goes. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Sir, next, behind you? Yeah. Thank you.
What's your take on the 5G situation in Huawei?
Yeah, so I've written on this too, but I happen to think that Huawei is the threat that the Trump administration makes it out to be. I don't think there's any chance that the Chinese government is not deeply involved in Huawei products from a security and programming, et cetera, perspective. I think this is a necessary step that has to be taken. It's very likely that what's going to happen is that the world is going to be divided into two camps. The Chinese camp, which will largely appeal to developing countries, and then the developed world camp, excuse me, which will largely appeal to American allies, et cetera. But no, I'm with the Trump administration on this, and I honestly don't understand how so many of our allies think that this is not a problem. I mean, the UK think that this is something they can manage, and we're not worried about it. I think a lot of them are really concerned about the impact it's going to have on their bilateral relationship, when they should be thinking about, well, what happens when the US isn't going to share intelligence with you anymore? Yes?
Was American exceptionalism a myth in your mind?
It depends on the era. I think we used to be exceptional. I think we still are in many respects in terms of our values and what we stand for, et cetera. But on the global stage, I mean, it's increasingly seeming to me like it's the case that we're less and less exceptional. I think that exceptionalism in some respects has translated to China in a different way. I mean, they have great appeal to many countries and many people around the world. I'm not sure that's going to change. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who don't happen to like us very much for a variety of different reasons. And so China is a natural alternative, as is Russia.
This isn't the first time we've heard of some Asian country who's going to conquer the world. I remember when I was in college, one of them was, and didn't work out that way. So in the case of China, what would you view as weaknesses? Certainly their demographics are not as strong, looking at the aging of their population. But what other things could could get in the way of success of their ambitions?
The thing that concerns the Chinese Communist Party the most is that things will spin out of control domestically. That's their greatest concern. I don't know that they have many concerns on an international basis. I mean, they're running circles around us in so many ways, in the international arena, and things don't get done in the multilateral development banks and the UN without the wink and the nod of China. And that's okay. I mean, because there are some standards in place by which we're all supposed to be adhering. The question is, will those standards remain in place, and will the rule of law remain in place going forward? Yes?
Mine was going there. I wanted you to go and press a little further and talk about Hong Kong.
Oh, yes, okay. Well, I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and I really admire what they're doing. If they don't draw the line at this juncture or some other juncture like it, then there's just, this is just going to spin out of control. I don't see how Carrie Lam can possibly last. And I don't know that she will necessarily be replaced by anybody who's necessarily perceived as much better from the Hong Kong people's perspective. But I think everybody understood when 1997 came around and they changed hands, that all of the things that China promised that it was going to do vis-a-vis Hong Kong were not going to come true. It's taken 20 years or so to get there, but I think the Chinese people have said, no, we're not going any further with this, and if you want to impose that kind of thing, you're gonna get a fight from us. That should continue.
I'm going to pivot with a different question. You didn't mention Brexit.
Yes.
And Brexit in the context of creating instability, if you will, or just the dynamics across Europe. And so 50% of the company that I lead sits in EMEA, and 50% of that sits in the UK. So I was curious if you had a take on that and how it applies to what you covered and shared with us.
Certainly looks like Boris Johnson, otherwise known as Bojo, is going to be the next prime minister. I love his hair, by the way, because I wish I had some. But I don't think that there's much of a chance that the rest of the European countries are going to get on the bandwagon and look at the dissolution of the European Union. If that was the case, I think many of them would have already done it. Some may not have done it because they think this is just taking forever to reach a final conclusion. But I think a lot of organizations have already prepared for this outcome, and yours may be one of them. And I don't think there's much risk that there's going to be some sort of a calamity. I think nobody wants that, and the Europeans will find a way, I think, to work with reasonable parties within the British government and, of course, British companies, et cetera, to try and find some accommodation. But I'm not sure it's going to get any prettier anytime soon.
That's probably a great note to end this discussion on. Daniel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your good questions.